Charles Grandison Finney was an American minister and leader in the Second Great Awakening in the United States. He is often called the father of modern revivalism. Charles Finney came into fame as a revivalist, professor/president of a unique educational institution, and advocator/defender of Christian perfection. Finney challenged common ideas about conversion, evangelism, and personal holiness in order to reform American Christian thought, which was his major goal. Charles Finney, as an evangelist, spoke about these such revivals using emotional sermons to urge his audiences to devote their life to God. Alongside this, Finney preached against slavery, fought for abolition, and cared deeply for African American civil rights. He supported the Underground Railroad efforts to rescue slaves. He used reason and the Bible to show how Christian perfection is attainable, necessary, and required by God. He also wrote books such as Lectures on Revivals of Religion and Lectures on Systematic Theology, which were widely circulated and read. All of this caused him to have a huge impact on Christianity and American society in the 19th century. Though Finney was criticized for some of his doings, he is the best candidate for the United States University due to his revivalism and his contribution in the Second Great Awakening. Frederick Douglass was an American social reformer, abolitionist, statesman, publisher, advisor to presidents, and writer. After escaping slavery in Maryland, he became a national leader of the abolitionist movement in both Massachusetts and New York. Frederick Douglass' main focus was to promote freedom for all slaves. His goal was to abolish slavery in all its forms and aspects, promote the moral and intellectual improvement of the colored people, and hasten the day of freedom to 3 million of our enslaved fellow countrymen, as he said. He began doing this through his newspaper in Rochester, New York. This newspaper was known as the North Star, due to the fact that the slaves escaped at night and followed the North Star in the sky to freedom. In addition to this newspaper, Douglass also lectured on the subject of freedom to huge groups of people. He did this by telling his experiences and also advocated for slave rights and women's rights as well. One of his most famous events was his very first public event in 1841 at the Church of the Rev. Thomas James, where he first talked about his slave experience and encouraged him to do so in future events. He went from slavery to becoming the leading African American voice of the 19th century. Frederick Douglass brought much awareness to the rights of both slaves and women. He encouraged slaves to develop skills, take responsibility for their actions, and join the army to prove their well-deserved citizenship. Eventually, Douglass's work led to President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which set slaves free. Therefore, Frederick Douglass is the best fit applicant to be admitted into the United States University due to his astonishing abolitionist efforts. Susan B. Anthony was an American women's rights activist, social reformer who devoted her life to racial, gender, and educational equality. She was also an American writer, lecturer, and abolitionist. Susan played a pivotal role in the women's suffrage movement. Since a young girl, she was committed to social equality. At 17, she was already collecting anti-slavery petitions. Susan B. Anthony traveled around the country delivering speeches in favor of women's suffrage, which at times caused her to be in risk of arrest. She attended the Seneca Falls Convention and continued to spread the word of what was discussed. She was an editor of a famous newspaper called The Revolution. There, Susan spoke about the ideas of equality and rights for a woman. She began to lecture to raise money for publishing the newspapers and to support the suffrage movement. Susan B. Anthony also formed the National Women Association to push for the constitutional amendment that would allow them to vote. A major event that occurred was that she voted and got arrested for her action. It led her to leading a protest with the speech named Declaration of Rights. Overall, Susan B. Anthony led the way towards the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote. This makes her the most eligible applicant for the United States University due to her constant fight and determination that she had for the women's rights movement.
Dorothea Dix was an American advocate who created the first generation of American mental asylums. She was an author, teacher, and reformer. Her efforts on behalf of the mentally ill and prisoners helped create dozens of new institutions across the U.S. and Europe which changed people's perceptions of the populations. She had a job teaching inmates at an East Cambridge prison where conditions and treatments of prisoners were so inhumane. She began agitating at once for their improvement. Dix visited every public and private facility she could access, documenting the conditions she found. She presented all this to the legislature of Massachusetts, which demanded officials take action toward reform. Her reports, which were filled with what is described as dramatic accounts of prisoners flogged, starved, chained, physically and sexually abused by their keepers, and left naked and without heat or sanitation. This shocked her audience, which created a movement to improve conditions for the imprisoned and insane. Her determination makes her one of the most eligible applicants for the United States University. Brook Farm, which was formerly known as the Brook Farm Institute of Agriculture and Education, was a utopian experiment of communal living in the United States and in the 1840s. Communal living is an intentional community of people living together, sharing common interests, property, possessions, etc. The Brook Farm was founded by Minister George Ripley and his wife Sophia Ripley. George Ripley was a journalist and reformer whose life, for half a century, was said to mirror the main currents of American thought. He was a member of the Transcendentalist Club and an editor of the Dial, which he left to found the Brook Farm community. He directed Brook Farm for the next 6 years until 1847, when financial setbacks forced it to close. The Brook Farm promised its participants a portion of the profits from the farm in exchange for performing an equal share of the work. This makes George Ripley an eligible applicant for the United States University.